Right, so last chapter we finished off exploring not only Stoker's treatment of the Dracula legend and how many others copy his ideas, but we also looked at a very highly sexualized experience between Jonathan and three female vampires, where we looked at whether or not Stoker could be suggesting that human sexuality could be regarded as a threat to civilized society, and the idea that men are so easily or can be so easily manipulated sexually and are unable to resist. And if you recall, we ended on the line that said, then the horror overcame me and I sank down into unconsciousness. So he has been so overwhelmed by this. Please remember the fact that the next journal entry continuing on doesn't mean that something has happened between him writing the word unconscious and his opening of his first sentence. It's obviously just Stoker has chosen to break it there in the chapter, to create another chapter. Please remember that, again, this is a construct. This is all created for effect. And Stoker, this is a part of AO2 and looking at meaning. And Stoker wanted us to end a chapter on this almost blackout, this very dramatic kind of theatre idea. Okay, so again, bear that in mind, that this has all been constructed in a particular way in order to achieve a particular effect, and we need to remember that Jonathan is now going to be struggling with a situation because he should have, as a good moral Christian man, a Victorian gentleman with a fiancée, he should have been able to resist, and we know he couldn't. So chapter 4 starts off with Jonathan Harker's journal being continued. In this chapter, we are going to see Jonathan's efforts to try and get a message out to his boss and his fiancée, Mina, but this is all going to be foiled. We're going to see that Jonathan is going to find Count Dracula asleep in a coffin in a dilapidated chapel, and he's going to Count Dracula is going to set out for London, and Jonathan is going to attempt to escape. So we open chapter 4 with I awoke in my own bed. So again, it's following immediately after the episode with the three women. The focus on the verb awoke, again, is the implication that perhaps what he experienced was a dream. And this can be reinforced by the statement, if it be that I had not dreamt. So although Harker is saying that this is possibly a dream, I think Stoker is providing this possibility so that it will alleviate any guilt and allow Jonathan to alleviate any guilt because of the way he behaved. He should have been strong enough to be able to stand up to this the sexual temptation, but it seems that he was unable to. Again, we are reminded that the Count must have carried me here, that if the Count indeed carried Jonathan from this part of the castle back to his own room and an unconscious body, a dead weight, which is very heavy, he must be again very, very strong. One must consider as well when we're looking at strength, and especially since this is a literary construct and it's creation and the author is creating meaning, so we're back to AO2, is this just referring to strength of the individual in terms of physical, or are we looking at strength of character and determination? He goes on to say that my watch was still unwound, and I'm rigorously accustomed to wind at the last thing before going to bed. So he is even trying to convince himself that what he's experienced was real. Again, we are reminded that he is a rational, logical individual. This is reinforced by his comments that he regularly has these habits, like winding his watch, and he's looking for proof. He's very considered. He's very concerned that maybe he's losing his mind, and again, he's using the diary. He does point out that his diary is again written in shorthand, so that even if the Count does get hold of it, it will be a mystery to him. Because especially when he talks about there's no kind of sanctuary, there's nothing more dreadful than those awful women who are waiting to suck my blood. So he fears that this is inevitable. He realizes that he is very likely to not be able to escape these three women, that something else may happen. Okay, we then move on to the 18th of May to show that the time is passing, and it is essential that we realize this. Again, it's a diary. It's to show time is passing, and the amount of time he has spent isolated in this castle, and that will have an impact on his mental being. And he says, I've been down to look at the room again in daylight, for I must know the truth. And it's, what is the truth? So to what extent is truth reality or fiction? And again, by him reinforcing the use of the word truth, we as the reader are more inclined to believe what happened, because obviously what he is telling us is true. It is real. The door is, so when I got to the doorway at the top of the stairs, I found it closed. It had been so forcibly driven against the jamb that part of the woodwork was splintered. I could see the bolt of the lock had not been shot, but the door is fastened from the inside. I fear it was no dream, and must act on this surmise. So he does now begin to accept or suggest that what happened to him was not a dream, that what happened to him was reality. Now, bearing in mind that he has written all of this down, and that he has said he would hate for his fiancée to know what happened to him. The fact that he's now also admitting in this diary that he does believe this is what happened, it's quite a strong indication of his character, because he realizes what he did is wrong, but he is still willing to face the truth. So we move on again now to the 19th of May, and he says, I am surely in the toils. Last night the Count asked me in the suavest tones to write 3 letters. So again, we are reminded of this whole odd relationship that the two share. The idea that Jonathan is employed by the Count. The Count is his superior. So we've got that aspect. But we've also got the aspect where Jonathan was saved from these 3 ungodly creatures by the Count, and these 3 creatures in the Count disgust him as if he was just a commodity, which they would obviously be able to get hold of at the end. So can you imagine the kind of awkward situation that's going to be between these two when they meet? And he's been summoned to the Count, and note the Count is using the suavest tones. So the Count is acting as if the business with the 3 women has never happened, and Jonathan also does the same thing, and we're reminded of Victorian manners and Victorian ideas, and the fact that you do behave in a particular manner, and this is what he's doing. And he is asked that he is going to have to write some letters. And Jonathan goes on to say, he knows that I know too much, and that I must not live lest I be dangerous to him. So Jonathan realizes that his time on earth is now limited. He realizes that he is a liability to the Count because he knows too much. And although the Count gives the impression of being kind and suave and sophisticated, this is the complete opposite. Okay, both of them are conforming to societal rules and societal norms when it comes to interacting with people of middle class and aristocracy. And again, it's interesting because Jonathan goes later in the paragraph to say, I therefore pretended. And so he realizes what is going on, and he realizes the part that he has to play in this charade, and it is a charade. And ironically, this is where we get the idea, and we start to pick up the idea that perhaps Jonathan could be regarded as the Count's doppelganger, or the Count is Jonathan's doppelganger. So just a reminder of the Gothic tropes. A doppelganger has now, in a modern terminology, come to mean an evil twin. In terms of the Gothic, however, it does not necessarily mean an evil twin as in twins separated at birth or people who are identical, but much like in Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, the idea that we as individuals are have the ability to be good and evil, and that they maybe are separate entities within our being. So it's more of a Jekyll and Hyde situation than it is of an identical twin situation. But you look at perhaps Jonathan Harker being this repressed Victorian man who lives by certain ideals, lives by certain morals, and maybe Count Dracula being everything that he is repressed, and what could be let loose were Jonathan not to repress all his emotions. So again, it's just interesting because there is the argument, therefore, that the two are parallels, and they mirror one another in their behavior. Remember that, again, the irony is that Jonathan says, I therefore pretended, and he is mirroring the Count, who is definitely the epitome of appearance versus reality, because we've got this man who clearly is not telling us the truth. We don't, or this vampire, and he appears to be aristocratic, but at the same time he is a vampire. And it goes on. Jonathan says, so the letters are going to be sent out. The first should be June 12th, the second June 19th, and the third June 29th. And Jonathan ends this little section with, I now know the span of my life. God help me. So he is being told that he will be dying in just over a month. 29th of May to the 29th of June will be his last day. As I'm sure you can imagine, that must be quite frightening when you're told there is that argument that if you do know the day you're going to die, obviously there are certain things you can do. So the question is, would you want to know when you die? It does build tension, obviously, because the fact that Jonathan knows he's going to die, we know that his death is imminent. It's going to hopefully increase his desire and his desperate need to escape. So we then move on to the 28th of May, and we realize that it's 9 days since his last diary entry. So we've got to look exploring the two options, because if you remember previously, he was almost giving up, and the great gaps in between the diary entries were due to despondency and depression, whereas now perhaps the gaps are because he is spending his time trying to find an escape within the castle, because he even says there is a chance of escape, and he looks at how a band of gypsies have come to the castle, and he is going to try and give them notes or letters to give out, or to smuggle out for him. He does comment on the fact that these gypsies, there are thousands of them in Hungary and Transylvania, who are almost outside all law. They attach themselves as rule to some great noble and call themselves by his name. So although Jonathan goes ahead and he says this, he goes on to say that he's going to write these letters home, and he shows his education and he shows his research, that he knows who these gypsies are. But the irony is, again, he still says they attach themselves as a rule to some great noble. Now, if they are hanging around the castle, could they not perhaps have attached themselves to Dracula? Yet he is still going to attempt to get them on side. Okay, they are a very superstition. He says they are fearless and without religion save superstition. So they are very, very superstitious. And again, that goes hand in hand with the idea of vampires in Transylvania. So he says, I shall write some letters home and I shall try to get them to have posted. I've already spoken to them through my window to begin acquaintanceship. They took their hats off and made obeisance and many signs, which, however, I could not understand. Okay, so he's trying to build a relationship in order to get these guys to smuggle something out for him. But again, I draw your attention back to the statement that they attach themselves to a great noble. So automatically, by Stoker inserting that line, we, the reader, are beginning to think, hang on, Jonathan, are you sure these are the right people to be trying to get on side? It is very likely they're not going to do your bidding. We have again some ellipses to show that time is lapsed, and he comes back, so he obviously breaks off, and then he comes back saying, He's written the letters, and Mina's is in shorthand. So again, a reminder that he is able to write in shorthand. Mina, we know, is learning stenography, as we discover, as we will. Well, I've told you, but we will also look at when we meet Mina. And so she is. It's this kind of secret language that they use, and he knows she will understand. And he simply asked Mr. Hawkins, his boss, to communicate with her, and he has explained, says to her, I've explained my situation, but without the horrors which I may only surmise. So he's left out the horror because he's still not quite sure about it, and he says it would shock and frighten her to death were I to expose my heart to her. So he's really worried that if she does know and find out exactly what happened and what is going on, and how he feels about it, and the fact that he may be mad, it's going to really cause her great fear and great shock, and it could kill her. Now, again, this is the irony, because Mina is probably the strongest of all of the characters, especially in the Crew of Light. She is more blue stocking than not. So remember, we spoke about a Victorian woman, one that tended to be educated girl from university and kind of be more educated than her male counterparts, would tend not to marry and be referred to as a blue stocking, which was a derogatory term. But she's not necessarily that, but she is this. I think Stoker is trying to create a character who is strong, and a strong female character for us. Although, again, I wonder if perhaps he doesn't allow her to develop as fully as she should be able to. But again, back to this, the irony is that she is the strongest of all of them, and so she probably wouldn't be frightened. And remember, he gives her, because obviously you've read the text, when she comes and finds him in the convent, and he's unable to explain what happened to her, he hands her his diary and says, you read it. And she's the one who transcribes the diary for everybody else. So I think he's doesn't give her very much credit. She is far stronger than he gives her credit for. Anyway, so he passes the letters on, and he tries to get these gypsies to pass them on, but of course this doesn't work, and he gets caught. And he says, the Count has come. He sat down beside me and said in his smoothest voice as he opened 2 letters. Now again, it's that idea of this chill running down the back of your neck and your spine, because the Count seems to be, whenever he needs to be particularly evil, he seems to adopt a smooth and suave kind of voice. And he sits down next to Dracula, and he says, the scanny, I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry, has given me these, of which, though I know not whence they come, I shall, of course, take care. So it's menacing, because he says, let me show you how much power I have. The gypsies said, you wanted these delivered? But they gave them to me instead. So he's showing this terrible power that he has, not only over Jonathan, but over people in the vicinity. And we as an audience aren't surprised, or we as a reader, sorry, aren't surprised by this, because we're going, well, this kind of follows suit. He's adhering to a pattern. So he's able to thwart Jonathan Harker's attempts to communicate with the outside world, and he has this great control, because he's managed to get these gypsies to do what he wants. And he says that he must, one is from you and to my friend Peter Hawkins, the other, he said, as he opened the envelope, and the dark look came into his face and his eyes blazed wickedly. He seems to be enjoying his power. Blazed wickedly. Could it be that they shone wickedly because he's enjoying the power he has? Or is it because he's so angry, and he's trying to refrain from letting his anger burst out? And he goes on to say, the other is a vile thing, an outrage upon friendship and hostility. So the other is this letter that he tried to send to Mina. And he holds it under Jonathan's nose, and he's taunting Jonathan, and he says, look, I'm really disappointed. You've gone against my friendship and my hospitality. So you have committed a foul act on every level. You know, you betrayed my trust. And again, this is so a counter to the traditional Victorian gentleman. You would never behave in this kind of way. You would never behave and mistreat your host this way. So he's saying to Jonathan, you know, well, obviously you have offended me. And he says, he goes, it is not signed well, so it cannot matter to us. And then he calmly held the letter and envelope in the flame of the lamp until they were consumed. So again, the idea of fire. Perhaps the pretense is beginning to slip. Perhaps the idea that the statement, the outrage upon friendship and hospitality is an exclamative ending, an exclamation mark. Is he becoming angry? Is this showing the facade is starting to slip? Or has Stoker created a character that is able to really manipulate and pretend anger? And he goes on to say, the letter to Hawkins that I shall of course send on, since it is yours. And so he offers to send this letter on. To pass it, and he says, I'm really sorry. He says, your letters are sacred to me. You pardon, friend, that I knowingly did break the seal. So he seems to have reined it back in. You've gone against all my hospitality and friendship, but it's okay. It's okay. I'm going to send this letter to Hawkins. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to. I unknowingly broke the seal. Okay. Oh, he did not unknowingly break the seal. He clearly knew exactly what he's doing. And again, he's taunting Jonathan. He's highlighting the power that he has. And of course, Jonathan has now been informed that he's already broken all laws and rules of host and people who guest. And so now, of course, he can't go accusing the Count of breaking the seal, because that would be just rude. But also, he knows that the other things are going on in this castle, and he's still not sure if they're real or not. But this just seems to enhance his fear, and rightly so, because he realizes he's being threatened. Okay. So the Count says he's sorry for opening this letter, and the idea that he goes, oh, why don't you seal the letter again, and held out the letter to me, and with a courteous bow handed me a clean envelope. I could only redirect it and hand it to him in silence. Look at how much power he has. He's this veiled threat. Jonathan is completely isolated. He cannot even get letters out asking for help. After an hour or two, the Count came quietly into his room and woke him up. He was very courteous and very cheery, seeing that I'd been sleeping, said, so my friend, you are tired, get to bed. So this continual friendly facade just adds to the creepy nature and the frightening, threatening nature of the Count. All right, so we should rightly now be very, very freaked out by his behavior, the Count's behavior, and we should be worrying for Jonathan, who again realizes that his death is imminent, but we're not quite sure when. Okay. Right, so on the 31st of May, 2 days later, and again, the gaps in the journal could be reflecting either Jonathan's hopelessness, sense of isolation, and he's determined, or the fact that he is trying to escape or look for some form of escape. And it turns out, he says, the second paragraph tells us about his shock. He says, every scrap of paper was gone, and with it all my notes, my memoranda relating to railways and travel, my letter of credit. In fact, all that might be useful to me were once outside the castle. I sat and pondered a while, and then some thought occurred to me, and I made search of my portmanteau, which is his travel trunk, and in the wardrobe which I had placed my clothes. The suit in which I had travelled was gone, and also my overcoat and rug. I could find no trace of them anywhere. This looked like some new scheme of villainy. So he's being punished. He is being punished for disobeying the Count, and the punishment is that he is because he was trying to communicate with the outside world, all forms of communication or ways of communicating in terms of writing letters or penning anything have been removed. Any way of him being able to prove his existence, so the letter of credit, etc., etc., would be like his credit card. All of that has been taken away. So again, he has been isolated. It's almost like he is being treated like a child. It's being punished. For example, when you say, if I were to say to my son, right, you can't have your computer anymore. Or your phone is taken away for a couple of days. And he's doing the same kind of thing here. It's like a parent disciplining a child, but also he's taken away any means of escape, because if Jonathan doesn't have any shoes or any money or any identity, he is unable to escape. And the fact that this little section ends on, this looked like some new scheme of villainy, ending on ellipsis, which again highlights as the sense of tension, what's going to happen next. Okay. Then we move on to the 17th of June, which is 2 weeks later. So again, we see that this poor man is so isolated. Remember, this is a Gothic trope, and remember that this is part of AO2 and looking at how the writer shapes meaning by setting the dates and the entries so far apart. We are beginning to realize that stuff has been omitted because nothing's happening. Okay. So again, it's extreme isolation. This morning, as I was sitting on the edge of my bed, cudgeling my brains, I heard without, so outside, a cracking of whips and pounding and scrape of horses' feet upon the rocky path upon the courtyard. So, with joy, I hurried to the window. He, although has been stuck on his own and has been completely isolated and has been frightened by the power of the Count, he still jumps with joy at the sound of people outside. His spirit hasn't been broken. He believes he's still looking for some form of escape. Okay, and he looks out, and there, of course, we've got this each pair of Slovak with his wide hat, great nail-studded belt, dirty sheepskin, and high boots. They had long staves in their hand. I ran to the door, intending to descend and try to join them through the main hall, as I thought it might be opened for them. Again, my shock. My door was fastened on the outside. So again, he's being locked in the room. This time, the Count is not taking any chances, but similarly, he's still being treated like an errant child. So he runs to the window, cries out to them, because these peasants have come to the castle. They've come to deliver the wooden crates. And these crates are the ones full of that are going to be filled with earth, that are eventually going to be taken and put on to the ship. And it's again, we've got to look at the idea of earth and the significance, because of course it's about being buried in the earth. And remember, anything that is ungodly cannot be buried in a church graveyard, because that ground has had to be sanctified, and that means it has to have been blessed. And so, of course, the soil that Dracula is using comes from his property, so it's therefore got the blood of his ancestors and all the fear and all the nightmares that have almost seeped into the soil, and that's why he's going to be taking this soil with him. But notice how superstitious they are. They do things like spit on things for luck, and so again, it's the fact that they are superstitious reminds us that they again, and that it's the same group of people, say that they are very unlikely to support Jonathan. So it's this idea that he looks out the window with great excitement. Maybe he's going to find a way of escape. And it's the same blokes who are loyal to the Count. But again, notices their superstition. So, and why would they be superstitious? Well, again, they are not vampires. They are gypsies, and they are very likely, again, fearful of Dracula. So we move on to the 24th of June again. So the pace, although the pace within the journal entries is quite slow, and we are moving through time quite briefly or quite rapidly as we jump from date to date, but again, it has the similar effect of making us realize that, Jonathan's no longer finding comfort, because remember he talks about how this journal helps him look put his mind together. It's his form of comfort, but it's at the moment he's not writing in it as much, so perhaps he's becoming more isolated as we go. And he talks about how he hears the sound of a mattock, which mattock is a small pickaxe, and he's looking out the window, and he says, I'd been at the window somewhat less than half an hour when I saw something coming out of the Count's window. I drew back and watched carefully and saw the whole man emerge. It was a new shock to me to find that he had on the suit of clothes which I had worn whilst travelling here. So if you recall, earlier he has seen the Count slither down the wall like a lizard, but now he sees him in his clothing. So Jonathan realizes that Count Dracula is using his clothes as a disguise. He says this is then his new scheme of evil. Okay, so the Count is dressing in Jonathan's clothing and is sneaking out to hunt. And when people see him dressed in Jonathan Harker's clothing, they will believe that it's Jonathan Harker who is the one who is doing the hunting. And of course, when Jonathan disappears, in inverted commas, at the end of the month, because of course that's when he dies, it's a euphemism for dying, they aren't going to be in uproar, and they're not going to be surprised, and probably not likely to look for him. So we've got the clearly very diabolically clever individual, this man. This is all part of his plan. Jonathan has not only come to be of use and give him information about British law, but also to provide an alibi. Okay, and as Jonathan says a little bit further down, any wickedness which he may do shall be by the local people to me. Okay, so he says there, I thought I would sit and wait for the Count's return. And while he is, he looks out the window, and he says, then I began to notice that there were some quaint little specks floating in the rays of the moonlight. They were like the tiniest grains of dust, and they whirled round and gathered in clusters in a nebulous sort of way. I watched with a sense of soothing, and a sort of calm stole over me. I leaned back in the embrasure in a more comfortable position so that I could enjoy more fully the aerial gambling. So it's this idea again that we are reminded of the shape shifting. So all these tiny particles coming together, it's almost like these flying lights, flying insects, lightning bugs, fireflies, and they're all pulling together. This aerial gambling, it means they're having fun flying through the air, and it's the idea that all these things are nebulous are coming together to form something solid. And he says he hears the howling of dogs. Again, we are reminded of Dracula and his link to nature, his control over nature, his certain control. So again, another Gothic trope, but to keep reminding of us what he is like and how strong and in control he is. At no point is Dracula out of control at this stage. So he sees the dust form into new shapes, and he says he very quickly becomes hypnotized. Now, this is the first reference, and certainly not the last reference, to hypnosis within the text. Hypnosis became very, very popular during the Victorian era, and it was often used in kind of like carnivals, and the idea that you could make people do what you want them to do. So the idea that perhaps Jonathan is behaving under hypnosis. It isn't, I think, important to bear in mind that when you are under hypnosis, nobody can make you do anything, which we have now discovered, obviously. So if you are under hypnosis and you get up and cluck like a chicken, that you would be predisposed to do that. You would never do anything that as an individual you wouldn't do if you weren't hypnotized. So that's just quite interesting. So now Jonathan is going to try and escape again. He's now running because of course he's got nebulous things forming and all these creatures forming, and he is so overwhelmed by what's going on and what he's seeing, and he's so unsure of how to deal with it, how to cope with it, and whether what he's seeing is it's the whole idea of appearance versus reality. So he gets up and he says, I tried the door, but I was locked in my prison and could do nothing. I sat down and simply cried. And it's this point where we realize how overwhelmed he is. A Victorian gentleman would not show emotion. A Victorian gentleman would never sit down and cry. And I think that's also part of this issue that we have now as a modern reader, is that it's from this time that men were never supposed to show emotion. You were supposed to be staid and have a stiff upper lip. And I think it has a lot to answer for, because there's nothing wrong with showing his emotions. But so as a Victorian reader, however, they would have been completely shocked that this man sat down and simply cried. And it is perhaps the idea suggesting that he is succumbing to madness, whereas a modern reader will look at it and just realize how despaired and how desolate his situation is. He then hears or looks out the window, and he sees a woman with disheveled hair holding her hands over her heart, and she's very distressed and she's running. And this is a distraught woman looking for her child. Okay, she screams up, and she sees Jonathan's face in the window and screams up at him, "Monster, give me my child." So of course the Count has clearly been successful. He has gone out in Jonathan's clothing. She comes in, looks up at Jonathan, and immediately blames Jonathan for taking her child. So she thinks he is the kidnapper, which is exactly what the Count intended. And she gives him this description. She calls him a monster. And she threw herself on her knees, and so again, she's in supplication, she's begging, she's pleading. It's the idea of being lower and giving yourself up in prayer. She's screaming, and she's tearing at her hair, and she's beating on her breasts, and she abandoned herself to all the violences of extravagant emotion. And finally, all I could hear was the beating of her naked hands against the door. So perhaps I think we've got to realize that these are the actions of a distraught mother. She is seen in direct contrast to the three women in the previous chapter, the three female vampires. So we've got these three female vampires who are nothing but sensual and sexy. They are the vamp. They are the woman who is able to entice men sexually, who does not seem to have any conscience. They are that kind of femme fatale, if you like. And this is the mother. This is this woman who is a traditional Victorian mother, or traditional mother in any sense of the word, because she loves her child, and she's desperate to find her child, and she will do anything. And the way she is behaving, he says, and talks of the violences of extravagant emotion, would be typical of a parent, or especially a mother, who loves the children. Because remember, women were regarded as emotional. They were the weaker sex because of this. So is therefore, by contrasting her against these three femme fatales, is Stoker suggesting that women cannot be a femme fatale as well as a loving and caring mother? Can they only be one or the other? Some argue that he is suggesting that women cannot be sexually progressive as well as being motherly. Again, my question, therefore, is the fact that she's beating against her naked hands against this door, the idea that her behavior is futile. No matter how upset she gets, she's not getting anywhere. Is perhaps this a metaphor for the constraints placed on Victorian women? They are given a role, and there is no way they can escape this role. Okay, so I think we've got this idea. Then he calls the Count calls for the wolves, and the wolves come, and they devour the woman, and the episode is terribly grisly and obscene. And we are reminded, almost like in high definition, I think, if you were to look at it from a modern perspective, of just how cruel the vampires are. This mother is desperate. They have stolen a child, so they've gone beyond all kind of salvation and redemption by taking a child, because that just seems to be the worst kind of evil, and the idea that children are innocent, so by and easily manipulated, or violated by adults who are bigger and stronger. So the idea that they have taken a child means that there's no chance for redemption. They have no guilt. And childhood, of course, childhood innocence and motherhood were revered in Victorian England. They were held very high. It was and this is very likely due, due to the high mortality rate, because of both women and children during childbirth. And there was often, if there was any complications, and there were issues with hemorrhaging and perhaps in terms of cleanliness, but there was a high mortality rate. So motherhood, yeah, and women or mothers were held in high esteem. So the fact that we have Stoker taking these 3 women stealing a child to devour really does just show the reader that there is no turning back for a vampire. That is it. Once you're a vampire, your soul is never going to be redeemed. And it goes on, there was no cry from the woman, the howling of the wolves was but short. Before long they streamed away, licking their lips. So the idea that they have devoured, they have eaten her and found it tasty. Now, the wolves are, we cannot blame the wolves, because they are animals and are merely acting on animalistic instinct. But Jonathan goes on to say, I could not pity her, for I knew now what had become of her child, and she was better dead. So we've got to look at this in two ways. Firstly, I could not pity her, if you take it out, makes Jonathan seem, his lack of pity could highlight the depths of despair to which he's sunk. Okay, we are quite shocked by the fact that he is so lacking in pity, he seems to be so uncaring. So he says he could not pity her, but when you carry on and you look at the rest of the sentence, because he knows what happened and he thinks she's better off. So we've got this, he understands, and he feels that by being devoured and ripped to pieces by the wolves, she's escaped the horrors of being consumed by the vampire. So again, it's this situation that not only shows the reader how hideous vampirism is and how awful they are, but it shows Jonathan the true horror and terror that Dracula encompasses and represents. And I think we've got, Stoker has popped this in at this stage just to remind us of Jonathan's impending doom. This guy knows he is going to die at the hands of Dracula or his female vampires. And he says, what shall I do? What can I do? He is absolutely overwhelmed. And the questions mean, again, he's starting to question himself, and he is feeling guilty because he does nothing to help the woman. So on one hand, he says, well, you know, she's better off being killed by wolves than dealing with the vampires. But he's also desperate, and yes, he feels guilty, but what can he do? He's locked in a room. There is nothing he can do. And again, it takes us back to the idea that Jonathan's on this adventure, and maybe he's got a little bit of a hero complex, and he's struggling because he's unable to save her, and that is what a man on an adventure should be able to do. We move on to 25th of June, and he says, no man knows till he has suffered from night how sweet and how dear his heart and eye the morning can be. Again, the idea, he's almost now got this sense of hope. It's like, and he ends this little bit on here where he says, let me not think of it, action. It's almost like the attack of the woman and the child is a wake-up call for him. He suddenly realizes that he's got a choice. He can either sit here, mope, and suffer at the hands of Dracula and his horrendous terror, or he could be and perhaps ripped to get death by wolves, or he can try and escape. But if he doesn't try and escape, he's just giving up. So at least if he is ripped to death by wolves, and trying to escape, it'll be better than if he does nothing. And what happens if he succeeds? So he's woken up in the morning, and again, remember, in terms of literary study, morning represents new start, new dawn, new day, and so it's almost like he has this kind of excitement, this sense of hope. Yeah, that's it, I'm going to do it. Okay, and he says he's not, in fact, he can't stop and think about it. Let me not think of it. He must act, because if he starts to think, clearly he's going to back away, because what he has to do is so dangerous. So when he stops thinking about his actions, but starts thinking about what's going on, he starts to realize certain things. So he says here, it's always been at night time when he has been threatened, and so he starts to ask, can it be that he sleeps when others wake, and that he may be awake whilst they sleep? Okay, so once he starts to be logical and starts to think things through, he starts to realize the pattern that Dracula is not around during the day. Dracula's women are not around during the day. So he can move unmolested and he can move around during the day. So that is when he needs to be focusing his energies. I mean, he does realize how deathly frightening it is that the Count can come into his room while he's asleep, and that he cannot escape. But he's got to, whatever he chooses to do has got to be done during the day. So it's almost as if this death of the mother and child have spurred him on. He now seems to have this purpose. So notice how his language also changes. He goes from writing in this kind of negative, oh, woe is me, to now he has some form of action. And he says, yes, there is a way. So notice, look, that we've got this complete. We've had the doors always locked, no way for me. And then suddenly in the next paragraph, there is a way if I dare to take it. All right. And he says, so he writes kind of a farewell. He says, if I fail, goodbye, my faithful friend, and second father, goodbye all. So that would be his boss. And then he talks about goodbye, last of all, to Mina. So he knows that what he wants to do is dangerous and might mean his death. But at last he feels like he's taking control. He seems to be able to there's some action. He can do something. He's not feeling so pathetic and despondent. And so he's almost reverting back to the Jonathan Harker that we knew earlier in the text, where he's now becoming logical and rational and realizes that perhaps he can do something about his circumstances. So what has he done? Well, later that day, he decides to climb out the window, which again is mimicking and mirroring Dracula himself, who, as we know, crawls out the window like a lizard. And so it just explores about how he's agitated, how he has to get out. So in the detailed description builds a sense of fear, because is he going to make it? Isn't he going to make it? It's not a pleasant experience. But when he does get to the Count's room, he comes and he finds there is a heap of gold, covered in a film of dust, and there were also chains and ornaments, some jewels, but all of them old and stained. So again, the Count has great wealth, but it's old wealth and it's old money. And again, this is one of the Gothic tropes associated with Gothic horror, and that's the fact that the aristocrat, or the main antagonist, has got great wealth. Again, just notice how many of the doors were locked. He says at the corner of the room was a heavy door. I tried it, I could not find the key, and it's this constant locked doors and being stilted. And remember, opening doors are reminiscent of opportunity and ideas, whereas he is being constrained and confined within this space, and he is this prisoner, and we've got words. He's stuck in this as a prisoner, and he has to go through vaults, and he goes into a room. Well, he goes into this broken down, dilapidated chapel. Note chapel again with the religious connotations of Christian religion, and this is where he goes into the vaults and he finds these old coffins and piles of dust. Okay, now the fact that the coffins are kept in a dilapidated chapel is important, because clearly something has happened, that the ground here is no longer sanctified, and that just causes us to think, what has happened that he is using this ground to his advantage, in terms that when we talk about it's Count Dracula. Anyway, comes upon a room. In the third room there is full of lots of boxes, 15 all, and in one of them lay the Count. He was either dead or asleep, I could not say which, for the eyes were open and stony, but without the glassiness of death, and the cheeks had the warmth of life through all their pallor, the lips were as red as ever, But there was no sign of movement, no pulse, no breath, no beating of the heart. I bent over him and tried to find a sign of life, but in vain. Note again, Stoker's indirectly explaining that Count Dracula is supernatural. He's lying in a coffin. He could be dead, but he couldn't be dead, but he might not be dead because he doesn't actually look like he's dead, but at the same time, he doesn't have the physical indications of being alive. And we've got this whole use of listing because the fact that the lips were red, etc., but there was no movement, no pulse. And the use of the list just highlights that there are so many physical things that are not working, so he should in theory be dead, but his eyes aren't glassy. And this is again where this whole idea of the undead comes from. He could have lain there for long, for the earthy smell would have passed away in a few hours. By the side of the box was its cover, pierced with holes here and there, so breathing holes. I thought he might have the keys on him, but when I went to search, I saw the dead eyes, and in them, dead though they were, such a look of hate. So while he is lying there and supposedly dead, he's got this real look of absolute hate. Could it be the idea that if you repress your emotions, they can fester and build and lead into something absolutely horrific? Is this perhaps Stoker exploring the impact of being a Victorian gentleman, of not being able to discuss or explore emotions, of having to repress feelings and always have the stiff upper lip? Again, maybe that is not what Stoker implied, but when we look at exploring a literary text, it is open to interpretation. So perhaps the hatred in the eyes of Count Dracula is a metaphor for this feeling. Right, Jonathan, when seeing such hate, does a runner, understandably so. We now move on to 29th of June, again 4 days after discovering the Count, and he says, today is the day of my last letter. So remember, the Count had said to him, right, you've got these 3 letters, and the last one will go out on the 29th of June. So he knows that his time is up. We are reminded that the Count is in complete control, he has complete power, and that Jonathan has been absolutely isolated, and he's at the complete mercy of the Count. And Jonathan looks out the window and sees the Count leave the castle by the same window and in his clothes again. Okay. He says, as I went down the hall, as he went down the wall, lizard fashion. So second reference to him being a lizard, cold-blooded, cold-hearted, having no feelings, being scaly, all right, and unnatural. He says, but I fear that no weapon wrought alone by man's hand would have any effect of him. So again, we've got this being given as a reader indirect information as how to deal with the Count. So we know he can't cope with sunlight, he's never out during the day, he's a creature of the night. We know he can communicate with wolves, but he can't cross, he doesn't have a reflection, and he doesn't eat, etc., etc. Okay. So he says he came back to the library and he read until he fell asleep, and he was awakened by the Count, who as grimly as a man can. Okay. And he said, tomorrow, my friend, we must part. So the Count comes in and says to Jonathan, I'm sorry, tomorrow I'm going to leave, and you need to get ready because you're going to be going on your journey. And we kind of pause and think, well, hang on a minute. There was no way he was ever going to let Jonathan leave. So why has he had this sudden change of heart? Why has he... We know that, and Jonathan knows that he knows way too much. He's a liability. He cannot be allowed to escape. So we question, why does he do this? Why is he doing this ruse? Because he says here, yeah, I shall not be here, but I shall be ready, and I have hopes of seeing more of you at Castle Dracula. So is he enjoying giving Jonathan this kind of sense of false hope? Is he enjoying baiting him by saying, well, you can go now, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you again? Or is that statement, I'm in hopes I shall see more of you at Castle Dracula, more sinister in terms of you're going to be a permanent fixture here? I'm not. But when I come back to my castle later, hopefully I'll see you there, because you're going to be turned, or you're going to be a vampire. Is that what he's trying to say? And he says to him, well, you can go tomorrow morning. And Jonathan says, why not tonight? He says, well, because my coachman is busy. Jonathan says, well, I'll walk. Brave, considering the wolves. And the Count says, and your luggage. And I mean, it's really quite interesting. We much like Jonathan, because remember, we're now starting to identify very much with Jonathan, are completely surprised that Dracula seems not to be adverse to the fact that Jonathan's saying, I'll go immediately. We know there's no chance that he's going to leave the castle alive. So again, this build-up of tension, we want to see where this is going, why he's doing this, why is he creating the sense of false hope. And again, it's Stoker's way of showing or highlighting indirectly to the reader how sinister this character is. He will stop at nothing. There is no redeeming feature in Count Dracula. We at no point must feel sorry for him. Okay. And he goes on to say, and he's really pleasant, and he's with courtesy, which is very incongruous with, so his words and actions don't seem to be matching up. And Jonathan says, to my intense astonishment, I saw the door was unlocked, and suspiciously I looked around. Okay. And it's all very, very frightening. The only choice Jonathan really has is not whether to go now or not, but it's whether to get consumed by wolves or get eaten by a vampire. So that is where now we realize that the Count is toying with him. You choose your death. Death by vampire biting or death by being ripped apart by wolves. We serves to remind us again how immense the power of the Count is and how animalistic his nature is. He is barbaric. We are repulsed and revolted by him. Okay. Shut the door, I shall wait till morning, says Jonathan, and the result is a red light of triumph in his eyes. Again, the Count is very much enjoying his experience. He's enjoying taunting and tormenting this young man. And it says, then last I saw of Count Dracula was kissing his hand to me, with a red light of triumph in his eyes and with a smile that Judas in hell might be proud of. So just to remind you of who Judas was, it's another biblical reference. Judas is the one who betrayed Christ for 30 pieces of silver. He was one of the 12 disciples. And he spoke to the Roman soldiers were looking to have Christ crucified, and they needed to have someone identify him. So Judas was paid 30 pieces of silver, and he went and said to the soldiers, the one I kiss on both cheeks, that is the Christ. Sadly or ironically, Judas was so overwhelmed by his guilt that he didn't end up hanging himself. So Jonathan is now lying down in his room, and outside he hears the voice of the Count, yelling at our vampire woman, saying, back to your own place, your time has not yet come, wait, have patience, tonight is mine, tomorrow is yours. There was a low sweet ripple of laughter, and in a rage I threw open the door and saw without the three terrible women licking their lips. As I peered, they all joined in a horrible laugh and ran away. So this is his second visit, the impending visit from the three vampire women. Note the use of language. He talks about the sweet ripple of their laughter in contrast with horrible, terrible woman and horrible laugh. Again, we could be exploring Jonathan's conscience warring with his physical need. But again, the Count has staved off the second visit. So he says, goes back into his room and he throws himself on his knees and he prays, and he's praying for tomorrow, and Lord help me. And he has been saved. He has been saved, but from what? From himself, or from his desire, or from the woman? I'll let you think about that. Okay. 30th of June. So we're on the next day, and he said, these might be the last words I ever write. And he slept till dawn, and he's now going to take the risk, and he's going to go and try again. He says, I am determined that if death came, he should find me ready. So he has personified death. So again, remember AO2 shaping a meaning. So it's the idea that he is ready to meet his maker. He's now not interested in all the rubbish. He's now something's got to happen. He's got to make a change. Okay. And what he is choosing to do is he's hoping in the daylight to be able to do something about the Count. So he climbs down the wall once more and goes to the Count. And he sees the Count in his coffin for the second time. Okay. Remember, the first time was more of an adventure for him. He was exploring, he was trying to find a way to escape. This time is far more daunting because he's actually aware of what faces him, and he's got a mission. He wants to come and try and destroy the Count. So this is his mission. And as he looks into the coffin, he realizes that the white skin seemed ruby red, the mouth was redder. All right, the cheeks were fuller. So, and he was gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech. So what we are beginning to realize is that the blood that Dracula consumes makes him younger. And this is very important because later when Jonathan sees the Count on the streets in London, it is a much younger Count. So it is the idea that fresh blood keeps him or helps him grow younger. Again, a Gothic trope, the idea of the symbolism of age versus youth, and it brings to mind the whole idea of the story of Dorian Gray, where he stays forever young, while his image in a painting is what ages. Like that, okay. So he looks down there and says, I stopped and I looked at the Count. There was a mocking smile on the bloated face, which seemed to drive me mad. Okay, so he makes quite a lot of reference to madness in this passage. And again, it's the idea that we can look at madness in terms of anger as well. And this idea of repression and desire, and by repressing our desires and not dealing with the situation, we can become, in fact, mad. Okay. He says there was no lethal weapon at hand, but I seized a shovel. Okay. And he goes he's got the edge downward and he's about to stab Dracula. But as I did so, the head turned and the eyes fell full upon me with all their blaze of basilisk horror. Now, the basilisk was the king of snakes. Again, I'm sure those of you who have read Harry Potter will be slightly familiar with this. When Harry Potter has to fight the basilisk. But the idea is that the basilisk is the king of snakes and he has this hypnotic stare. Again, a bit like the idea of Medusa and being hypnotized by eyes. I think what we need to remember, though, is in both cases, death is the ultimate outcome. So Stoker is suggesting that Jonathan Harker is no match for Dracula's hypnotic power, because remember we spoke about hypnosis a little bit earlier, and clearly Dracula is a threat to Jonathan's logical and rational mind. So again, looking at the idea of them being the opposites of one another. Well, what does he do? Because these eyes open, when he tries to stab him, he merely takes a deep gash. He cuts open the forehead. The fact that Count Dracula seems to be able to control Jonathan through ideas of things like hypnosis, even at rest, makes us realize what a frightening enemy he is. Even when he is not fully conscious, he has this control. And his control is such that even in this kind of comatose state, he can stop Jonathan from killing him. Jonathan can only make a gash. He cannot actually take his life. We also, however, realize again surreptitiously that that he would have to probably decapitate him rather than stab him just simply through the heart. He refers to this is the second time he refers to Dracula as a thing, again dehumanizing him, and he says, the last glimpse I had was of the bloated face, blood-stained and fixed with a grin of malice, which would have held its own in the nethermost hell. So Jonathan is going to run away, obviously, but wishing he had managed to kill Dracula. His marking of Dracula, this gash on the gash on the forehead, foreshadows the final inevitable conflict. The fact that Jonathan's actually able to mark Count Dracula on the forehead, despite his seeming huge power certainly shows that, or implies to us that Dracula has some vulnerability. There is some way of killing him. He says, I thought and thought what should be my next move, but my brain seemed on fire. So up to this point, we've had in the novel, things have been fairly slow, but now it picks up. So now the pace is extremely rapid. He's trying to kill Dracula. Dracula's eyes have opened. He's done a runner. And what's taken paragraphs and paragraphs and journal entries to get to this point now takes only a few paragraphs to the end. And he suddenly realizes that Dracula's been taken off by the gypsies and he's got to do something. He's been trapped in this room. He's completely isolated. He's has been unable to, well, he's trapped, he's kind of run away, and he's relied completely on sound. And it says the door is shut, the chains rattle. There is a grinding of a key in the lock. So beautiful Gothic features, this whole idea of fear. I hear the creaking of lock and bolt, and he hears the sound, hark in the courtyard. He hears the wheels and of the cartwheel. So he now knows, or cartwheel. So now he knows he's got time. If he's going to escape, it's now. He says, I'm alone in the castle with those awful women. Mina is a woman, and there is naught in common. They are devils of the pit. Pit being capitalized because, of course, hell and pit. So he decides he's going to make a break for it. He says, at least God's mercy is better than any of these monsters, and the precipice is steep and high. So he realizes he's likely to die. He's clearly still logical and reasonable, so he has not yet succumbed to madness, because he realizes that falling into off this cliff is far preferable to being killed by the vampires. So this man is still demonstrating logic. To end it all, he says, goodbye all, Mina, and shows the fact that he's exclaiming Mina at the end shows his fear and his worry and despair. It's not the first time he's ended a diary entry on his fiance's name, as we know in this chapter. But the fact that he ends it now with goodbye all and Mina is a very good sieg, and allows Stoker to sieg, because the next chapter is going to start with Mina's voice. So like the blackout at the end of the previous chapter, this is very dramatic. It's a very obvious device. He's going to be poised. We imagine him poised on the edge of this precipice, and we don't know what's going to happen to him. We don't actually find out until chapter 4, but we've got this idea that this guy is on the very edge, and it's an obvious device to introduce a new voice and a new perspective. So like the shifting from the natural to the supernatural, sleep to wakefulness, appearance to reality, Stoker is now shifting in perspective. So we've got this and we're going to have now this contrast between this logical, rational Victorian man and the apparent emotional Victorian woman.